Good afternoon and welcome to our second webinar series in which we are discussing the latest advances and challenges in developing and implementing IPM. We'll pause a moment to let folks enter the room. But as you enter the room, you'll note that you will be muted, but please feel free as any questions arise to put them in the Q&A or the chat. There'll be ample opportunity at the end to ask our panelists questions. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. All right. Again, welcome. I'm Dr. Lakeisha Odom with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our second webinar series where we're discussing research opportunities, barriers, challenges, opportunities in the IPM space. Can we advance to the next slide? As I noted, this is how we will spend our time together, a little bit of welcome and housekeeping. I'll share a little bit about the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, or FAR, for those that may be unfamiliar. Then I'll transition to our amazing moderator to share a bit more about the IPM Alliance. And then we have a dynamic set of speakers that will come and share their perspectives with you. Then we will have the opportunity for some Q&A from the audience. So again, anything that pops up that you would like to ask all the experts that we have access to, please feel free to do so. Next slide, please. This is just a reiteration that you'll be muted. So if you have questions, the chat or Q&A will be monitored the entire time. There will be time at the end for questions. And we also are recording and sharing this webinar with any registrant via email. And the recordings will be available on our website. You'll receive a message following this webinar with all that information. So if there's a slide or something that you can't quite remember, you'll have access to the recording as soon as the webinar is over. So by the end of the week. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I am a scientific program director at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, or FAR. We are a 501c3. We were created in the 2014 Farm Bill in an effort to increase investment in public agriculture research. We also look at compelling research gaps, and we complement USDA's research agenda. Since our inception, we've awarded about 450 grants. Over $800 million dollars have been funded and matched, and we have over 550 distinct partners. We work across 4 of what we call our priority areas, and they are cultivating thriving production systems, which looks at animal and crop production, bolstering healthy food systems, which look at both urban agriculture as well as health, nutrition, food waste, food loss, sustaining vibrant agroecosystems, which looks at everything from water quality to resilience and soil health practices, and finally strengthening our scientific workforce, which looks at investing in our next round of scientific leaders. The reason that we do the work that we do is we recognize that public investment in agricultural research generates $20 of U.S. benefit for every dollar of research spent. The next slide will share a little bit of how we do what we do. So as I mentioned, we are complementary to USDA's research agenda. We seek to address critical research gaps across the supply chain. We are often looking for ways to focus on actionable science. Farmers are always centered in the current challenges that we try to address, and we would like to see projects that move research from the lab into the field. So as you hear our panel today, you can see why IPM as a topic is very compelling for FAR to be interested in, as it does address key knowledge gaps, actionable science, farmer focused, and the ability to have that actionable, translatable research. Next slide. So as I mentioned, under our research priorities, we look at ways in which tools, technologies, models can bring things to scale, can provide site-specific decision-making, and to allow producers to create, build, and maintain healthy, productive agroecosystems. And we believe that IPM is an integral part to the development of that healthy and productive ecosystem. We recognize that we need to have a more systems-level approach with IPM. If you want to reference our first webinar, we have a bit more discussion, a dynamic discussion around the current research needs and gaps. And so that might be something nice to reference back to. But we recognize IPM should not be treated as a standalone topic, but a cross-cutting strategy at a systems level because it intersects biology, technology, management, it bridges sustainability, and it enables resilient systems level agriculture. So if you think about the role that FAR wants to play in this research space and the things that we've prioritized, IPM is a clear area in which we want to continue to invest in or explore. Next slide, please. So we recognize that from initial discussions and engaging with stakeholders, for IPM to reach its impact, it needs to be adoptable, profitable, and scalable. And when we're thinking about scale, or at least when I was thinking about preparing for this webinar, I was thinking about how we need more coordinated action. And some of the spaces that this panel will discuss are around like risk management and mitigation, possible opportunities in finance. And some of that is in order to encourage adoption, the barrier to entry has to be lower to encourage the willingness to try a new practice. There has to be trust in the decision so that producers know if they introduce something into their system, that they understand how it works and they're supported in understanding how it works. And then also recognizing that with many agroecosystems practices, it may take a bit of time to see the initial benefit. And as a result of that, you want to make sure that we can communicate the benefits, other co-benefits of IPM, and also encouraging farmers to stick with IPM long enough to see those long-term benefits. So I believe there's one more slide. Yes. So before I transition to our moderator, I just want to say that some of the things I was thinking and we've been thinking as we've been working with the IPM Alliance is that we recognize IPM is not a suite of, it needs to be a suite of tools. It's not a one size fits all. We also have to figure out innovations that can make things easier, cheaper, more reliable, and also an enabling system that facilitates adoption. So I think many times we think that all of the decisions lay with the grower only, but a lot of the conversations we've been excited by are thinking about how do we create an enabling system that allows for the adoption that we would like to see. So we recognize that thinking about things like risk or finance are key to scaling and incentivizing because these are the factors that do influence heavily economic feasibility of adoption, perceived risk, behavioral incentives. So with that, I have the pleasure of transitioning to Dr. Tom Greene, who will introduce himself and the panel, and he will be your fearless moderator today. I'll turn things over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just having a little problem with my Zoom application here. Here we go. I think I've got it now. Well, great. Thanks for that introduction, Lakeisha, and for yours and your FR team's great support to the IPM Alliance partnership with you on this project. It's just been wonderful to work with you and your team. So next slide, please. As you see, I've got a bunch of roles in my retirement. I retired from directing the IPM Institute 5 years ago, and now have several volunteer board roles, including operating my own pest control company in Madison, Wisconsin. Um, so let me introduce the IPM Alliance to you. We're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit formed by board members of IPM Voice, which was formed back in 2010, as some of you may remember. And now we've transitioned to the Alliance. We're involved in a number of projects, including this one, and recently completed one that was led by former board member Larry Elworth and funded by NRCS and in partnership with IPM Institute, American Society of Agronomy, and NC State University. And the goal of the project was to increase participation in NRCS programs for IPM. There were 3 webinars produced as part of that project, and participants in this webinar will receive links to those webinars in a follow-up email from TN. The links are also in the last couple of slides of this presentation for those who will be listening to the recorded version of this webinar. So they're accessible there too if you come back to this webinar. Next slide, please. So in this project, in partnership with FFAR, Alliance is working to establish a public-private research collaboration to fund and conduct new critical research on IPM needs. So we're working to put together a group that will collaborate on identifying and pursuing priority research in IPM. Next slide, please. So our objectives are to identify and encourage and support new and innovative research, support creation of a greater knowledge and innovation in the application of IPM, and create wider support and collaboration through the ag supply chain, risk management, and finance chains. We want to make more resources available to increase the benefits of IPM adoption in agriculture. Now today, next slide please, our webinar is focused on finance and risk management and risk mitigation perspectives on how to scale and incentivize IPM adoption. As you heard, this is the second in a series of three webinars for this series to launch our project. So today we'll hear from our panelists, followed by Q&A. Please post your questions in the chat at any time, including indicating which of the panelists you might like to direct the question to. We're very fortunate to have a great slate of panelists today. So Jeana Cadby, who serves as Director, Environment and Climate for Western Growers, focusing on sustainable agriculture solutions and farmer advocacy. Clint Pilcher is Technical Knowledge Team Lead at Corteva Agriscience. And Dan Sonke grew up on an almond farm and then recently left a role as Global Sustainability Leader at Blue Diamond Growers. And you'll learn more about each of those as they speak and share some stories of their work. So, given the focus of our webinar on finance and risk management today, I wanted to start with my own story about advancing adoption and tackling risk. So some of you may have been aware of this project. From about 2004 through 2014, I worked with a team that included Jim Cuby, a former chief counsel for the Senate Ag Committee, and one of the leads standing up NRCS's EQIP program. Also included Brian Brandt, an Ohio farmer, also working for our American Farmland Trust, and many others. The project was called the BMP Challenge, BMP for Best Management Practices. And what we did was we devised a guarantee for farmers that if a farmer lost money adopting a BMP, and there were a number of BMPs that we guaranteed, including reduced tillage, managing nitrogen and phosphorus inputs, or IPM for corn rootworm, and these were in corn and soybean crops. We paid the farmer if the BMP netted less than the farmer's current practice based on a comparison to a check strip. The program included a requirement that participating producers had to work with crop advisors to implement the trial. They typically did it on maybe 20 to 40 acres in a field. And the program was supported by a series of NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants, Great Lakes Protection Fund, EPA, and others. But the bottom line was just super impressive. So we would survey the participants following their experience, and 87% indicated that they would continue and expand the practice. Really impressive number. But guess what? We paid farmers about 40% of the time, much higher than we thought we would. Big factors in the high payout rates, learning curve was definitely number one. So even though these farmers were working with a crop advisor who helped set up the check strip, and make sure that the BMP practice was implemented as best as possible, and then also participated in doing the comparison at the end of the season. There's so many things that can go wrong when you're starting out a new practice. That was our biggest single factor. A second one was weather. Many BMPs will pay out over the course of several seasons, but in any one season, a really rainy spring can cause the field to lose a lot of nitrogen, for example. But 40% still means that majority of our farmers came out ahead financially, even in the first year. And they do better than that after they've climbed the learning curve. And it was just a great experience for them to work with somebody with the knowledge on the BMP, who could do all the mechanics of the check strip, make sure that was in place, help supervise the harvest. And also at the end of the season, they would get a very clear net returns comparison between the check strip and the rest of the field, in addition to what they could see by eye. And so we were happy with that outcome. We wanted NRCS to adopt the approach as an ongoing equip element, but unfortunately we didn't succeed there. And one of the objections was that we were sending the wrong message that BMPs could fail, and could certainly understand that concern. But certainly they fail, especially during the learning curve phase. But still, 87% adoption is pretty hard to beat. The program was also costly at $40 to $60 an acre, including paying the crop advisor and making payouts to farmers when the guarantee had to come into play. But it was an unlimited number of acres. Most farmers used it just 1 year, and perhaps that's not a bad price to pay to get 87% adoption. So maybe we can working together, we can take some of those lessons that we've learned and work to put options in place for farmers to help them reduce risk, maybe along the lines of a trial practice guarantee. So now I'll turn things over to our panelists, and remember to keep an eye on and contribute your questions to the chat and indicate who you would like to answer if you have a preference. So Jeana, let's start out with you, and I believe you have the next slide.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys having us. My name is Jeana Cadby. I am the Environment and Climate Director at Western Growers. And do you mind going to the next slide? I just wanted to quickly introduce who Western Growers is. We're a grower association that represents family farmers in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And this is for fresh produce, fruits, tree nuts. And so our membership makes up about half of the fresh produce production in the United States and about half of the organic produce in the United States. So we're pretty focused on the fresh produce area, and I essentially work on the agronomy side of things and sustainability. Do you mind going to the next slide? So we have a lot of topics that we cover, but I kind of wanted to generally look at the areas of focus that we have, including sustainability. Our science team does a lot of work there. Also, food safety. We have a program called Greene, which is aggregating food safety data and really making actual insights off of that data. And then, of course, we have our automation initiative. We do a lot of innovation collaborations. And so it's kind of just a super brief overview of what we do. I'm happy to talk more about the work that we do. But I do want to get into IPM. So if you can go to the next slide, please. What I wanted to cover for fresh produce in particular are kind of what are the challenges that growers are facing and why, how that kind of aligns with how do you get adoption of IPM and how do the economics kind of pen out for that. So if we look at these numbers, the cost of compliance for growers has gone up significantly in the past few years. Since 2006, it's gone up over 1,000%. We also have very little change in the farm gate prices in that similar time period. So prices going up, but not the return on those prices, right? So we're not seeing that on the grower side. We're also seeing a lot more competition from imports overseas, right? So like less production costs that might be competing with local production. And then we're also seeing a reduction in the total number of farms. We're seeing a lot of family farms that are choosing not to continue business or other things, but we are seeing that decreased number of acreage as well. So the challenge in California or the West Coast generally for us is we're seeing a lot of pressure in terms of, how do we stay in business and how do we make sure that we can maintain these farming operations? If you can go to the next slide, please. So also on top of that, we're also facing a lot of pressure from climate change, and we are hearing a lot about climate change and how that's impacting agriculture in terms of hotter hots and wetter wets and drier dries and that type of thing. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is we're having this impact that's referred to as an atmospheric sponge. So if you think of the atmosphere as a sponge that can hold moisture and heat, that sponge is getting bigger. So its capability to kind of draw up that moisture and maintain that heat is getting stronger and more robust. So when we have these extreme weather events, that is kind of driving that vulnerability there. And so there's a lot of challenges in terms of how do we build resilience in agricultural systems and in a system it's already challenging to farm. So if you can go to the next slide, please. That's one of the reasons why we're really interested in biologicals, for example, or just really trying to look for adding more tools to the toolbox for growers. And biologicals have a lot of opportunity as a prevention tool. There's other, outside of biologicals, there's other things that we're also interested, but I just wanted to pull this out because it does look like there is increased interest in biologicals and increased adoption of biologicals. And what we're trying to assess and help that adoption is, understanding, does it work? What are the economics and how can it actually be implemented on farm? And if we talk about, when we talk to growers about biologicals, a lot of times, especially with biopesticides, we ask them, okay, do you use any biopesticides on the farm? And they might say, very few or maybe not really. And then when we get into it, it actually looks like they are using biologicals, but they're not calling it biopesticides or biologicals. At that point, it's just it's just called a pesticide, right? It's like integrated with their program and it no longer has that kind of potentially negative connotation that we often see with biologicals. So we're trying to better understand, where is that coming from? Is it the efficacy challenge? Is it a cost challenge? So how do we actually kind of cross that barrier where we know that there's products that are effective and are economical, and how do we get those into the hands of growers? So my last slide here is, really just looking at what we're trying to do as an association is enhance the competitiveness and profitability of farming and lead the industry towards a healthy, sustainable, and resilient future. And I just think there's so many opportunities here with IPM and everything that surrounds IPM. So we're just really excited to be here and to support however we can with this initiative.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeana. And Tien, are we holding questions for the moment? Are we moving right on to Clint or?
There doesn't seem to be questions in the chat at the moment, so we can have Clint go next.
Okay, great. Well, Jeana, I thought that was really great. And, it's striking. No increase in farm gate prices back to um, 2019 or whatever. And what we've had 20% inflation since 2020. And we're no longer in the glory days of IPM. When I started back in 1979 in a pilot Apple IPM program in Massachusetts, we had lots of opportunities as we shifted from calendar-based applications to IPM. And at the end of the 5 years, our growers were using half as many applications and getting better high quality fruit. Nowadays, when everybody is using some level of IPM, we don't have that potential for IPM to cut input costs like that. And in fact, when you talk about newer chemistries and biologicals, you're often talking about increasing costs. You're using more specific materials and perhaps more applications of more expensive chemistry. So it really is a lot of pressure on farmers and important for us to find ways to incentivize adoption, particularly of practices that help us broadly in terms of health and environment, but add expense for growers. So Clint, I think we'll turn it over to you and
All
go ahead. I
right.
think you've got the next slide. Great.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all, and thanks to the panel and the invitation from FAR and Tom. So, yeah, my name's Clint Pilcher. I lead a technical knowledge solutions team here at Corteva Agriscience, and I'm located in Johnston, Iowa. I just shared kind of the experience I've had. I've been working with biotech traits most of my career. So BT corn for control of European corn borer, corn rootworm, fall armyworm, especially in, North America, Latin America regions. But then fall armyworm, went global as far as a pest. So those are probably the three pests that I've spent most of my time on in corn for my career. Spent half of my career so far with Monsanto Company, did research, an entomologist by training, um, and went from, field research to sort of really technical training to a lot of the licensees of the technology across in North America, and then spent some time leading a lot of the development protocol work for those traits. And then I moved to Pioneer Hybrid around 2011. Was in a regulatory role. So I got to work with insect resistance management, had a global strategy role there for 7 or 8 years. Then went back into some of the research space, and then I was lucky enough to transfer to a technical training role, and I worked on seed and traits for a bit. But then I've been fortunate enough the last 3 or 4 years to lead the team in Corteva that builds global materials to help our field organization as well as regulatory folks and investors and things, learn about our technologies. And so really enjoyed that. And I want to talk about some of those concepts that I've learned over the past few years. As well as my participation, I've been working with Tom on IPM Voice panel or board, and in creation of this IPM Alliance that we've referred to, and really looking forward to that continuing to develop. But more importantly is some of the global experiences along the way, going to Africa, working, in Zambia with fall armyworm, and that's that lower picture. But I really also enjoy the outdoors and fishing and hunting, and so I think part of part of learning for people is to gain those shared values and experiences from people, so that you can really, that's where you start to build trust. And that's one thing I really through my career learned that I want to talk a little bit more about here shortly. So next slide, Tian. So what I wanted to do is highlight a paper that actually is just hot off the press, and it's called growing our future through responsible crop protection, and it's a paper by Krell et al. 2026, and what it's doing is expanding upon things that we need to think about in addition to the tenets of IPM, and how we need to continue to evolve to work through this. So next click, Tian. And sorry, some of these slides build, so you have to bear with me. So what does responsible crop protection mean? It really means proactive, highly modernized update to the traditional concept of IPM, which is our gold standard. So next click. And it's really based upon three primary criteria. We all know first, you have to have effective control solutions for pests, vectors, and pathogens. That's where it starts. The second criteria is to have no unreasonable adverse effects on humans and the environment. And then third and finally, probably the most important, is that it needs to be economical for farmers and consumers. So this is really, I don't think any of this is anything new to any of you. But then it goes further to discuss the tenets of responsible crop protection. So if you go to the next slide, Ian, and go ahead and click on the next piece. So yeah, Okay, you want to stop there. And we'll go through these. There's 5 main tenets. And, the first is that, and when you think about responsible crop protection, I don't want you to just think through that we're talking about pesticides. Okay, we're talking about crop protection. It can be, through cultural, a diverse range of tactics. It can be transgenic or biotechnology. It can be using different tools to protect that crop. So you need a diverse range of tactics, and everybody's very familiar with IPM, the base. 2, innovation. So responsible crop protection prioritizes continued improvement of existing crop management tools. And there's been a tremendous amount of innovation into how we identify and design new crop protection active ingredients for synthetic chemistries, how we develop our traits, how we use genome editing to improve disease resistance. So tremendous amount of new technology to improve upon what we've experienced over a lot of decades of integrated pest management and traditional crop protection tools. Responsible crop protection relies on science-based crop management policies and regulations. So they need to be based on robust and transparent data. And I think we all can agree with that. And I think it's key word here is transparent. And that's something we'll touch on here in a moment. But also economic viability. So the cost of implementing responsible crop protection must not outweigh the financial benefits for farmers and consumers. It champions adequate, affordable, diverse, and nutritious food. But what I want to spend some time on is this last one. So if you could click one more time, Tian. So I really feel like our greatest hurdle to implementation of IPM or responsible crop protection, as I've introduced it here, is really public distrust in bringing new tools, out there, and so how do we overcome this confirmation bias? So, what is confirmation bias? If you present someone, with empirical data that really contradicts their deeply held beliefs about food safety or synthetic chemicals, it causes sort of this severe cognitive dissonance. And, the brain will reject scientific facts to protect its view of the world. And that's how we respond. So we need to kind of stop believing that providing more data will naturally lead to public support. It's not that we don't continue to do science, and we need the science-based information on how to manage a product, how to implement it. We need the science, but it's really how we go about communicating and trying to implement the science. And in facts alone rarely change minds. Okay, and that's we have to find a better way to build trust, and I think that's a challenge and has been a challenge. So it comes down to how we go about doing it, and it's built when people see that you share the same values they do, and so kind of move from being experts to more about thinking about how would we interact with our neighbors, right? And so the first step is especially for a big company like the one that I work for, Corteva AgriScience, start demonstrating radical transparency and kind of pull back the corporate curtains, if you will, and share how do we build these tools and what do we care about? We care about all the same things that the public cares about. But really, being very transparent and demonstrating that we build based upon sustainability criteria, especially UN sustainability criteria that have been, around for quite a few years now, and that we strive for all of our products to meet those criteria. So, if you want to click one more time, Etienne, sorry, I think yeah. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So those are some of the RCP tenets, and then my last slide is really to talk through what I try, for those of you that might know Shane Thomas, in Upstream Ag Insights, he put us out a newsletter, and I've really throughout my career, can relate to building, learning more about innovation, adoption, Everett Rogers also has a book written on diffusion of innovation. And what are the things that matter, all right, when you think about how any new solution or new technology is adopted. And these are sort of the things that, you've got to try to understand. What's the relative advantage of that solution? How compatible, how complex it is? Is it easy to trial on a farm? And what's the observability of the result? And sometimes that's very hard to measure, especially when you think, there's a lot of fantastic work being done with biologicals. Sometimes it's difficult to measure those results immediately. Sometimes they're more long-term results. But the other big thing here is this idea of adoption chain risk. And if you want to hit the slide twice, 10, so go one more. Yeah. So, and what this talks about is really that the benefits is not, we often think about the farmer and the end user and what are the benefits for that, for the farm. But actually, these innovations to really, be positive, and if it's responsible crop protection or new IPM tactics, it has to be a win-win-win throughout the whole value chain. And so you can have something that has a tremendous amount of value for the farmer, but if the chain, like the retailer, with the example of innovation A, does not see any benefit from it, it's probably going to fail. So when you look at innovation B, there's less value there, but everybody shares in that value. And so I just thought this was a tremendous way of kind of visually demonstrating that if we think about the IPM alliance moving forward, we have to find a way that how all entities and organizations in the whole value chain benefits from the implementation of IPM. So I'll stop there, Tom, and looking forward to questions.
Well, that was great. Thanks so much, Clint. And I don't know how many decades I've known you, and I learned some new things about you and your background today.
Great.
So
Yeah.
that was super. So Dan, we'll turn it over to you, and I think you've got the next slide.
That's correct. And yeah, Tom and we've also known each other for a couple decades now. And hey, folks, Tom, thanks for the invite to present. Thanks to everybody that's joining today. Really excited to be here and share a little bit about my background and how it touches on IPM. I just have the one slide, so I'll verbally speak to a lot of this, and hopefully some of the things I throw out will also spark conversation for the rest of our time together. So I am Dan Sonke, and as Tom said, up until very recently, I was with Blue Diamond Growers. More about that in a minute. But my career really did start, as Tom said, on an almond farm in California. Then I studied sustainable agriculture in the Midwest, but promptly moved to Florida and worked in tropical ag for 6 years until I decided to go to grad school and did a degree there. It's a doctorate, but it's not a PhD. It's a DPM degree. And DPM is kind of an unusual, almost unique doctorate, a professional doctorate in integrated pest management developed by the University of Florida starting in the year 2000. And so I was in the second starting class. It's a professional doctorate. It has 3 times the coursework of a PhD program, but no research. So a heavy load of entomology, nematology, plant pathology, soil science, production systems, and then practical internships in fieldwork and integrated pest management. So really taking the breadth of integrated pest management and applying it to applying an ecosystems approach to the entire agricultural system, which turned out to be a really great launch into a 20-year career now in developing sustainable ag programs and certifications. And that's where Tom and I met each other when I was still a grad student. We worked together on developing a sustainable ag certification program. And I did several of these types of things for 5 years as a consultant, developing programs, some in conjunction with Tom, really trying to take the entirety of the IPM approach to beyond just pest management to the entire system and get farmers recognition in the marketplace for adopting sustainable agriculture. And then I went to Campbell Soup Company and developed their sustainable ag programs for 10 years. So programs around processing tomatoes, programs around wheat for their Pepperidge Farm division. And then later when they purchased some potato chip brands, joined the Potato Sustainability Alliance. And on several of these programs, pest management and IPM were critical. Campbell's has had, even before I joined, a long history of IPM adoption, demonstrating reduction in pesticide use in their processing tomatoes. And I took over tracking pesticide use throughout my years there. The Potato Sustainability Alliance, which we joined, had already at that time had been developed around IPM and reducing pesticide risk, and that was one of the key reasons why we joined it when I was at Campbell. And that these programs that we had around IPM were actually instrumental. It never made the news, but there was potential for a shareholder resolution to be filed against Campbell Soup on pesticide use, and we were able to show the activist investors that we had IPM approaches going on already prior to them approaching us, and that enabled us to convince them to withdraw it before it ever went to the shareholders. So really proud of those things that we did. But I always wanted to come back to almonds. And so 5 years ago, went to Blue Diamond Growers and developed all of their sustainability programs for 5 years, including a $45 million regenerative agriculture program funded by the USDA, driving specific regenerative agriculture practice adoption. Really proud of that work. The company has decided to change its approach to sustainability, so I left there 3 weeks ago, but still very proud of that ongoing program in regenerative agriculture. When we did our initial assessments 5 years ago on sustainability at Blue Diamond, pest management did rise to the top 5 issues, and we struggled a little bit to know how to measure IPM adoption with almonds, and then to craft programs around it. But that actually is a good segue into another role that I have had and still have with the Almond Board of California, chairing the Environmental Stewardship Working Group. Back prior to my Campbell days, I had a role in developing what is called today the California Almond Stewardship Platform, a comprehensive sustainability program for almond production in California. I wrote the IPM chapter of that program, so cataloged with university research all the best practices for almond IPM, and that chapter is still in place. It has been modified by other experts since my time. And one of the innovative things that other people did in that program is looked at all the practices and came up with a framework for measuring IPM adoption within that chapter and tracking IPM adoption for the almond industry. And just tying it back to my time at Blue Diamond, it's not a sure thing yet, but one of the last things I put in place there is a proposal to add some funding to our regenerative agriculture program to fund the adoption of one of the key practices that we saw could move the needle for Blue Diamond growers in IPM adoption as measured by the Almond Board's program. So stay tuned. I'm pretty confident they'll be able to get that funding and start incentivizing grower adoption of that practice. And then finally, wanted to also mention that for 2 years, I was privileged to be part of a working group that created a roadmap for the state of California on sustainable pest management. The Sustainable Pest Management Roadmap is a public document. It is an advisory document. It does not have the weight of law, but it is a roadmap that the state government uses to think about reducing pesticide risk in California. It's worth checking out if any of you are interested in seeing what California is doing. It's not without controversy. I will be very clear about that, but it does try to look at advancing IPM in California. It does also have components of regenerative agriculture, which is kind of an interesting thing that maybe we'll discuss today, depending on what questions come in. What is the intersection between regenerative agriculture and IPM? but it's worth looking at that document as something that's driving change in California. Lots more I could say, but I think it's best that we continue on to our discussion time.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan, for that. And so I'm going to dive into a couple of questions to get the discussion going. We've got plenty of time for a discussion here, which is great. And so the first question is, what have you seen that works? In particular, anything that you've seen in this arena of economics and finances and risk management. We have lots of historic literature in IPM about the barriers to IPM adoption and finances and incentives and risk management appear frequently. But what have we seen that works? What are successful programs and why were they successful? And while you're thinking about that question, panelists, I'm going to provide a first answer. And you jogged my memory, Dan, talking about Campbell's soup. And Hassan Balkan and Bill Reinhardt back in the early 90s devised a guarantee for Campbell soup growers. They were asking them to get on board with the IPM program, and in particular, late blight weather-based forecasting. And they told the growers, okay, we want you to do this, please. And if it fails for you, we're still going to buy your crop. And Hassan said they never had to buy anybody's crop. And that was an amazing innovation, that weather-based forecasting system that works well for late blight around the world in potatoes and tomatoes. And so that was a success for Campbell Soup many moons ago. And I'll let you panelists indicate who wants to go next with addressing that question.
Yeah, Tom, you're right. That program predated my time, to be clear. Hassan and I maybe overlapped a month, I think, before he left the company. And but in my discussions with him, confirms what you said, that they never had to pay out any payments in that program. It worked really well in processing tomatoes. They tried the same approach in some other vegetables in the Midwest, where they had different weather challenges that had lower levels of success, but still a great effort that had stunning success in tomatoes, certainly. And to be clear, the tomato program did cover Midwestern tomatoes at that time, I believe. I believe they were still doing Midwestern tomato production at that time.
Clint, Jeana, any suggestions? Audience, please feel free to throw something in the chat too if you have a reference to a success story you'd like to share.
Yeah, your question is in regards to success stories for adoption.
Success stories in IPM generally, but also anything in particular addressing the topic of today's webinar.
Yeah, I guess I'll kind of go around answering that question. I think how we often think about this is change equals risk often, right? You don't know what happens on the other side of that change, and implementing that change can sometimes be costly especially without knowing whether or not it's going to pay off in the end. And I think with evaluating risk, we've talked about this when we were kind of prepping for this panel, was, how do you kind of prove a negative in terms of sometimes you don't know that the practices that you're doing as, for example, preventative are actually prevented, right? Whereas I think there are ways where you can assess the efficacy of a product by knockdown or by some other really much more visual or data capable way to understand, okay, this was, we applied this product and there was a result, right? So you can actually see the change that happened. So, we've talked a little bit about how do you how do you prove that something is effective versus you just applied it and then you just got lucky and nothing happened, or that type of thing. So in terms of transition, my question is often like who is paying for that, and oftentimes it does end up being the grower who's doing kind of the R&D of how do we integrate this into our farming system. And so how do we kind of spread that cost around so that risk is also spread. And so I think that we've seen helps in terms of, so for example, with new technologies, our innovation center will put together case studies where they've gone through all of the economics, all of the hours of labor, all of the, input costs, energy costs, the diesel usage up and down, right? And actually did one column is this is what would happen if you stuck with the current system, and then this would happen if you upgraded to this other technology, and actually break down like where are the cost savings or cost increases, and they might pop up in places that you don't expect. Like for example, there was a piece of equipment that ended up doing fewer passes in the field, so you actually saved on diesel costs, right? Where the equipment is cost more, but then the diesel costs went down. So having that kind of comparison with a case study is really helpful, and it takes a lot, right? Because that grower has to share all of those operational costs. The equipment company has to be willing to share all of their operational costs and everything kind of going behind the curtain. So I think that's where we've seen some success, is that transparency. But again, that's expensive to implement and hard to get everybody's buy-in. But it's been a really good, you can look up, if you search Western growers case studies, we have a couple case studies that have been really successful in translating that.
Great. Yeah, the
Yep, yep.
issue of risk and uncertainty is a real big deal, and that was one of the other issues that NRCS had with our project was, well, if we can't predict, ahead of time what the payout is going to be in any one year, how do we manage that as NRCS? That sounds like maybe it needs to be a crop insurance program, not an NRCS program. And actually standing up that program, Jim Cubey and I borrowed money from American Farmland Trust, and I took out a second mortgage on my house to finance the first fund. And I'm still married to the same woman after that, so it worked out in the long run. But it was dicey. I remember those days talking with Jim. Well, how are we going to do this? Are we going to take the risk? And we did, and we're successful at it. But Clint?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about your question, Tom, and I think back to the pink bollworm eradication program kind of in the southern US as being a premier example of how a successful program, came together. Not that eradication is always the goal of IPM, and we know that's not not necessarily a tenet, but the suite of tools that were available for the program were many effective tools. They had good chemistries, cultural controls, sterile insect technique, mating disruption techniques. They had the BT cotton. So they had many different tools, and it was coordinated, which really began by the cotton producers across West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and northern Mexico. And they were able to, get the funding needed, and because it was also supported not just the growers pushing it, but supported by federal, state, and local entities, including the universities and industry. So there was a coordinated effort, which we think about what are the minimum criteria for a successful program. It has to be coordinated. It needs to, really look at how can we phase something long term. So, not just trying to get a short term result, but how do you, cement the long term results? And this program to be, George Friswold from University of Arizona, I saw him give a talk on it, and it's one of those premier examples, I guess, where just long-term effects. It probably took 15 years to actually, be what they called success or reach their goals of the program, but it's had a significant lasting effect, and it was funded. It was, obviously it was funded well too to see that through. So, but quite a few pieces there that tried to, ensure that program success. So it's just kind of a model, really more about the system and how you put plans together to implement and getting all the right stakeholders in the room to build that long-term plan to be successful.
Cool. Yeah, I think in recent discussions about IPM, those area-wide programs are often raised. How can we work together to help manage risk and work towards a long-term outcome that's going to address economics and fit in well with the production system that's in place, not conflict with other elements.
Mhm.
Well, Tien, I see one question here from Pete Goodell. It's great to hear from you, Pete, and to hear you're still around and interested in this work. Um, Pete asked about BMPs, that they had a clear net dollar benefit for farmers. How could the value of increased ecological services be measured? And that's actually been a topic within the IPM Alliance, IPM Voice discussion that led to, in part, to reaching out to FFAR. Is how could we get some dollars put towards measuring the ecosystem service benefits of IPM and climate benefits of IPM. And in the next webinar, there'll be an individual who started a company that actually does those types of valuations and has done some work in the biologicals arena in terms of the climate benefits of biologicals versus some conventional standards, and looking at the impact of making a transition on carbon footprint. So that'll be an element of the next webinar next month that will be discussed. But that's a key piece. There are multiple programs out there, government and private programs, that are paying farmers for delivering benefits. And one program I'm aware of is where an apple processor is paying farmers to create pollinator habitats on their farmlands. And and how do we assign a value to that practice that is going to be sufficient to incentivize farmers to make that investment is a key question, and something that our partnership with FFAR could potentially fund development of numbers for some IPM practices in terms of their ecosystem benefits, and recruit partners to pay that compensation to farmers for the benefits that they're delivering to the broader public.
Yeah, Tom, if I could jump in, you haven't asked this question yet, but as we think about challenges to IPM program adoption, one that keeps coming to my mind is related to what was just discussed, and that's measurement of adoption. And I'm particularly thinking in relationship to corporate sustainability or corporate regenerative agriculture commitments that are common. I spent 5 years at Blue Diamond, which not only has its own retail brands, but also is a major supplier of ingredient almonds to other companies. So I spent a lot of time interacting with global food manufacturers as part of their climate commitments or their regenerative agriculture commitments. And I have to say IPM did not come up that often, which I think is regrettable, because so much of the thinking around those programs today is focused on supply chain resiliency and supply chain reliability for these big multinational food companies. But they're overlooking the fact that climate change is driving pest changes, and crop failures have always been related to pest management. So how do we send a signal to these supply chain programs that IPM is a way to increase reliability, increase resiliency, reduce other risks in their supply chain? But then also, how do we measure it in such a way that it can be communicated as a way that they can track and then incentivize? Because these companies are incentivizing adoption of certain practices that they think will drive resiliency in their supply chains. So how do we better create monitoring measurement tools that can then also result in partnerships with corporates that can show them that there's resiliency happening? I think that's one of the challenges that I hope the Alliance can tackle.
Yeah, and making it economical for growers to provide whatever the documentation is that's required to earn those incentives. That's often
Absolutely.
a real challenge. Oh my goodness, look at all this record keeping and calculations, and am I going to be liable if I make a mistake here? And um, well, your question, Dana, is a good segue into one of the others that I have for you. And that's what do we need to do to bring IPM back into the conversation about resilient systems? IPM is an essential piece of the foundation for sustainable and organic and regenerative, but sometimes it loses um, recognition, very blatantly, like supply chain program I'm familiar with claims to not do IPM anymore. They're doing regenerative ag, but they're doing crop rotation. They're doing scouting. They're still doing these IPM tactics, and often organic growers will, bristle at the term IPM, and some of that is left over from the decades ago, the real struggle for organic growers to get some recognition and resources, while IPM was getting large investments from the government. Um, Yet IPM, if you read the organic standards, there are IPM techniques developed in the 70s and 80s that are peppered throughout the organic standards. So how do we get better recognition, or do we need to get better recognition of IPM's contributions in support for those programs, including sustainable organic, which have been around for a long time, and now regenerative? The terms have been around for a long time, but it's really getting promoted now, and maybe that's okay for IPM just to continue to be in the background, and we need to focus on the technical folks in terms of incorporating IPM into those programs, regardless of what it's called, and not try to get recognition of IPM beyond the technical side, and into the marketplace conversation. But any thoughts there?
It's a very broad question, Tom.
Yes.
I do think that well, let me back up. So some of the regenerative agriculture schemes that are out there are very insistent that it build off of organic first. And that does present challenges in driving adoption of regenerative practices with conventional agriculture if there's not also a definition that allows conventional production to move in a more regenerative direction. And that's an argument that's being debated in other forums. We don't need to hash that out today. There are schemes that are trying to start with conventional agriculture and use the term regenerative, which I have a lot of respect for. and yet some of them seem to be intentionally leaving IPM and pest management out of the mix because there's some lightning rods they don't want to touch, which I think is actually a mistake. I think we need to encourage, wherever any of us has a voice, to encourage regenerative agriculture definitions to also be including IPM approaches, because without that, I think you will lose some consumer respect for the term regenerative if you're using it without some sort of an IPM approach to mitigating pesticide risk, if nothing else. So encouraging that in regenerative agriculture, wherever we have a voice, I think is important. But that might be a controversial thing, so maybe Jeana or Clint have other ideas.
If not,
I mean, I
I
agree that you both mentioned this, right? So we often see the same practice being cited as a different umbrella category, right? So what was IPM is now regenerative, or what was regenerative is organic. And I think at the end of the day, what the objective is that those practices are being implemented. So from the grower perspective, I'm not sure that it makes a huge, to us, I don't know that it makes a big difference that what it's called, as long as it actually helps the grower at the end of the day. I will say, certainly there's certifications and things like that that kind of will muddy that a bit. So maybe that's kind of an oversimplified way of thinking about it. But I think really, ultimately, we want to identify what works and how to get there. One of the things that you mentioned, Tom, that I think is worth thinking about is when we think about pest pressures, we often think about, okay, what are all of the tools that can address all of these pest pressures? But from our perspective, there's multiple categories of pest pressure. There's like maintenance pests, right? So something that is going to consistently pop up every year or during certain parts of the season. And then there's kind of these other, unexpected or high priority or pests that are kind of beyond maintenance levels. And if we're asking tools, whether they be new tools or maybe tools that have developed a lot of pesticide resistance, or maybe they're just not as effective as they used to be, to address some of these challenges that they're not equipped to address, then we're kind of setting it up for failure, right? So I think part of it too is looking at what are the actual pressures that we are dealing with, and what is the best way to address them given the tools that we have. And I think IPM is able to address that avenue, whereas some of these other terms, it's more of a holistic systems approach as opposed to kind of. So I think what I'm trying to say is that, when I'm framing it in my head, at least, it's, looking at kind of how do we address these specific challenges with the specific tools that we have available versus how do we kind of have this holistic, like, conceptual approach. So I don't know if that makes a difference here or if it's fully off track, but I do think that we need to be able to see what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the tools that we have and use them accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to try to, we're constantly trying to define or redefine, what IPM means and what it means to different professional entities. So, Tom has heard me talk about, what the weed scientists think versus the entomologists, versus, and we kind of get hung up on terminology more than, realizing that all of us have a common ultimate goal. So I think, and I just saw this note here from Noreen in the chat that, what matters most is trustworthy certifications, and not using the term with no verification, right? So it's like, people are going to get caught up in the jargon or not understand because of what terminology is used. It's like, well, what does regenerative really mean? Or instead of just, really, it comes down to people, building some trust with the folks that are advising you at the local level, and not either through certifications or recognizing that knowledge background exists to provide a valid recommendation, which you would hope includes IPM as its foundation, right, from the recommendation. So anyway, yeah, it's challenging because through all layers, and Lakeisha could probably comment on this, because she's probably seen it all with regards to these discussions that happen all the way up through uh, EPA, USDA, all the universities and stuff. So that's been a frustration through my careers, that we're all trying to redefine or whatever, and IPM. I've heard IPM is an entomological term. It's not weed scientists don't look at it that way, and so anyway, it's frustrating.
Well, I think, Tin, could I turn the Q&A over to you for a moment? Lakeisha mentions that we have a question in the chat.
Yeah,
I addressed the one about the BMPs from Pete Goodell. I don't see the other one.
we have
So
two
that we
in the
have some
Q&A, Tom. We have two in the
See,
Q&A.
I see a
great.
question here from Jim
Yep.
that I think is a great question. And of course, totally makes sense that Jim would ask such a great question.
Yes, it does.
The question is, in relation to long-term benefits of IPM and potential incentive support, what are the special considerations for farmers operating on leased land? And this is a great question because this has come up with not just IPM, but also with just practices in general. So things that so health practices, organic practices, anything that requires consistent long-term investment, whether that be financial or actual practices in that same location. So if you are rotating land with other growers or you don't have long-term access to that land, some of these practices are really challenging to implement without the buy-in of those other partners, or without even knowing, what's coming next, what came before you. So some of these shorter term crops are really challenged with how do we implement things that require potentially years, if not decades, to have that payoff when you don't have access to that land for years and decades. So I actually don't know how that incentives could work, right? But there's certainly opportunities to, like, for example, hedgerows, maybe working with the landowner and saying, hey, this is like a set aside that you need to work with every leasee, that it's not going to be implemented or turned into ag. I'm not really sure the answer to that, because I think unless we're all in it together and we all agree that we're, continuing these practices, sometimes you might lose all of that sequestration that you've been working on for years if it doesn't get continued by the next land operator. So anyway, I don't know if you guys have other thoughts on that, but I thought that was a great question from Jim.
Thanks.
And there's another question that's in the question answer about almond IPM adoption and how to get over some of the hurdles. What are the hurdles? There's a couple of ways I could attack this question. So from the late 80s through the 1990s, there was a very dramatic reduction in organophosphate use in almonds. I was not really a part of the industry during that period because I was away from California. But my understanding is that it was driven by a few things. There was concerns that there would be regulatory action against organophosphates, although I don't think there were any real threats at the moment when it was happening. But then another thing happened was, research was done and softer materials were released to the market, and the research by the Almond Board and the University of California and extensive outreach demonstrated that you could move away from organophosphate use during the winter time, reduce risk of those materials moving into the environment, and then you could still have very effective pest management without these harsh materials, and then also preserve some of your beneficial insects in the environment as well that have other benefits for other parts of the system. Actually, Pete Goodell could probably speak to this much better than I could. So that's one area where research, new materials coming available, lots of outreach had a dramatic shift. So great history of IPM adoption in almonds, but now you get to where we are today. We have some other challenges. We have pheromone disruption is available to the industry for our key pest. It has a decent level of adoption, but it's far from a high level of adoption. So how do we So why is that? Well, it's an expense. It doesn't completely replace other materials for that pest. Growers don't always understand the economics that it can pay for itself if done correctly. But so how do we get that information out there? How do we get over the expense hurdles, particularly when for the past 5 years, most almond farmers have not made a profit. So there's just that financial challenge is very real. And then another avenue of exploration in the almond industry is area-wide pest management and techniques that could be used to come together as an entire industry, do area-wide releases of sterile insects or other approaches to area-wide pest management. And that's where public partnership with the private industry would have to really come into play, because there's no one entity that could cover all the cost of the initial program and then and get it going without that public-private partnership, in my mind at least. And so how do we get that recognition from public agencies, organize the industry to make that happen? That's a challenge that the industry is wrestling with right now.
I like that you said that, Dan. It kind of makes me think about how a lot of these practices will require this community buy-in, right? So if you're like adjacent to residential areas or even adjacent to an abandoned orchard, right? Like they're all impacting each other. And some of these, making sure that all of the stakeholders are bought into what you're trying to accomplish and you're navigating all of their needs and being able to achieve that, that takes a lot of time. Whereas pests don't wait around for us to finish up our regulatory review processes, right? So like, how do you balance this high pressure need to address these pest challenges today that are happening today? We're already, we have every day we're getting calls where it's like, hey, we're seeing this spiking, we're seeing this going up, we're expecting this to be a problem. What are you going to do about it? And it's like, well, maybe in 5 to 6 months you might have a product, right? So like, how do you kind of balance this immediate need to address something that might be unexpected or needs to be addressed versus this kind of long-term community? Like, how do we get everybody to buy in and do this together? Because area-wide coordination is one of those things that actually would help if we could. It has that buy-in from everybody and has this greater impact that's even like logarithmic, being more impactful, but it takes time.
Yeah. Another example is pheromone disruption really only works when you have a block larger than 40 acres. So a lot of small farms are right under that limit. So how do you work with your neighbors and agree that if you worked together, it could be effective, but you've got to organize? How do you connect people together without literally going and knocking on doors? And knocking on doors these days is trickier because a lot of people don't live in the orchard. So, so how do you connect people together to make that effective as a tool, and to let them know that, hey, because your neighbor is going to do it, you could also do it, and it might actually work now. That social part that Clint was talking about.
Tian, do we have other questions in the chat or raised hands?
Yeah, we have one. An attendee asked, what role do regulators play for incentivizing IPM adoption? I think any one of the panelists can take a stab at it.
Well, I know from my experience in the past, EPA has had dollars set aside for IPM for grant programs, and as their budget got tighter and tighter over the last 15 years, the requests for applications disappeared, and so there's certainly potential there, but we need the will, the political will to make those investments. California regulators certainly. There was just an RFP that came out the other day about measuring ecological impacts around pest management. California is very active in that arena.
I think it's a
Clint?
great example, Tom, that we've certainly seen historically. There were a lot more funds for IPM available. I'd love to see some of that come back. I also would say regulators, just respectfully, we need to remember that IPM requires multiple tools in the toolbox, and sometimes regulators have been great at pulling tools off the market without necessarily recognizing that there needs to be more tools coming on the market, or else IPM systems do fall apart with resistance development and such. So just that one simple philosophical approach that we need to keep tools in farmers' toolbox is very important for IPM success. Jeana also did touch on biologicals and a lot of research there. The almond board is also working with Jeana's organization on researching biologicals for almonds together with Western growers. And what I also would say is that we all need to keep in mind that biologicals are not necessarily a drop-in replacement for synthetic tools. So there needs to be research on how does a biological fit into an IPM approach, and what are the differences in how you use that tool compared to the typical point and shoot kind of approach of synthetics.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like the best example that somebody explained, this is not, I didn't come up with this, but somebody described, like if you imagine a Rubik's Cube, if you move one block, right, to a different area, it changes the whole square, the whole thing. So the whole cube. So when we're talking about, finding additional tools or replacing tools with biologicals, it's exactly that. Sometimes we're asking a biological that may have been developed to address a maintenance level problem, but we're asking it to address a high pressure, like outbreak level problem. So we're setting it up for failure by asking it to perform something that was recently taken off the table would have been able to address with one application, right? So like, how do we not increase our lose tools so that we have things like pesticide resistance buildup or increased applications because things aren't working? And then how do we set up for success the tools that we want to try to promote and make sure that we have more access to and can be effective? So totally agree with you on that, Dan.
Clint, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to add, not enough time to, to cover it all about on this question. Regulation, my whole career has been around insect resistance management for biotech crops. And I think in some cases, or in many, obviously in many cases, having some framework there is certainly helpful. But, you know, it what's been interesting is to watch the evolution of what's been required from us. So I'll equate, insect resistance management as a component of integrated pest management, or it should be, but then it, evolved into best management practices for corn rootworm. So, it's like, hey, we're starting to see resistance develop. So then there was a lot of regulation put into ensuring that best management practices were implemented for corn rootworm management. And so and really it became more of a reporting uh, thing from a company to EPA on, okay, what's the percent of farmers that are adopting these approaches? And so, uh, so it kind of gets to be, I think letting the market drive, I mean, success you implement, companies have a strong vested interest in ensuring that these tools last a long time. And so to what degree you let the market drive as opposed to regulation driving what, is actually implemented with regards to management tactics, I think it can hinder progress in some cases. That's been my experience. But with regards to development of new tools, it's also it takes longer. To register products, you have global import approvals that are needed for products as well. It takes 100, $200 million to bring a new product to the marketplace, and 10 to 15 years. You've probably heard variations of those numbers, but it continues to increase. So regulation definitely plays a role. I'm not opposed to regulation. I'm just saying it needs to be more of a partnership, on how we continue to bring new tools to the marketplace, but also can we provide more research opportunities? Tom mentioned the grants and things like that in the past. How do we continue to incentivize how we can partner to implement uh, you know, integrated approaches from farmers. So yeah, that's just a little bit of added added color to that discussion. So
Yeah, I would point towards the Food Quality Protection Act
mm,
implementation as a great example of collaboration across all the sectors. And Congress passed that unanimously to give more protection to women and children from pesticide residues on food, and a whole suite of broadly toxic pesticides left the market and were replaced with effective alternatives virtually overnight in the scheme of things over the course of 10 to 12 years. And we didn't have huge food shortages because EPA was doing its job in terms of developing programs to register reduced risk products more quickly. USDA was making big investments in grant programs to help growers transition and help extension and researchers address needs during that transition. And industry just came out with one new product after another to provide options to transition to for growers. Well, I'll turn it back to you, Jen. We've just got 4 minutes left. You have a couple of housekeeping things about your follow-up email and okay, here are the resource slides that I mentioned earlier on. We have two of them, one here with links to the products from the NRCS project that Larry Elworth led. And then I think that is the next slide. Does that have the link to so these will be available online. You'll receive a follow-up email from Tien if you participated in this webinar that will include a link um, to these resources and also a link to the recording of today's webinar. Anything else we need to say to wrap up, Tien or Lakeisha?
Just a note of gratitude for everyone's time and attention today. And if anyone has any additional questions around this initiative or next steps, here's some information. Again, you'll get all this via email. So I'll leave our moderator with the last word, but I just want to extend heartfelt gratitude to Clint, Dan, and Jeana for giving us their time, attention, expertise, to all the folks that attended, to the folks that asked questions. And if you have any other follow-up questions that you couldn't think of at the time, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll direct them to the appropriate person. So I guess I'll give you, Tom, and the panel the last word.
Well, thanks so much, panelists, for participating today. It was great to learn more about you and the work that you're doing. And thanks to our participants for their contributions to the questions and discussion. And I would just say that this has been a 3 or 4 year effort to make this transition from voice to alliance, and connecting with FR has really helped us develop this idea for this collaboration. And it's great to be out in the public with it and getting input, and look forward to announcements as our project with FR and our other projects develop. So thanks, everybody, and hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank everyone for
thank
your
you.
time and attention.